Boundaries versus preferences. I'm the shepherd of black sheep, the wizard of radical self-respect, Jared Mello. Let's jump right into the topic here because there is a lot of confusion, I think, between boundaries and preferences, and there is certainly some overlap, but overall, the difference to me is this. Anyone can have preferences towards any number of things, but it can become a boundary for us if it's important enough for us to keep us safe and to protect us, whatever it is. And I'm going to give you some clear-cut examples of this here too. An example of a preference. Maybe someone is a Republican or a Democrat, and maybe you don't like Trump, or maybe you do like Trump, but that would be a preference either way. It becomes a relationship boundary for you where you would not date someone who likes Trump, or you would not date someone who likes Biden. That's where the difference comes into play. For some people, it might just be a preference. Oh, I'm not going to get along with Republicans. I'm not going to get along with Democrats, etc. It becomes a relationship boundary when it's important enough for us so that we wouldn't even consider dating someone like that or having them really close to us in our lives. That is the difference. Another example of a boundary versus a preference. Someone doesn't like people who smoke, but if they would still date someone who smokes, that's just a preference. They prefer someone not to smoke, but it's not important enough for them for it to be a deal breaker. A deal breaker would be, and a relationship boundary would be, you refuse to date someone who smokes. That's now a boundary. If it wasn't as important enough for you to not have it be a deal breaker, then it's just a preference. Another common one, monogamy. Are you monogamous? Because if you're monogamous and you talk to someone and they don't believe in monogamy, well, that is something you are going to have to act on now and say, well, this relationship's not going to work because you aren't monogamous and I am. And I think a lot of the confusion comes from people thinking boundaries only involve us, which in a way they do, but when it comes to relationships and who we let into our lives, their actions and their beliefs also matter too when it's a relationship. Clearly, with the monogamy issue here, because the relationship boundary is you are not going to get intimate with anyone else outside the confines of this relationship. And people who have problems with boundaries or would say boundaries only involve you, how do you explain the monogamy issue? Because you can't in that case, because it involves them and their actions as well. But here are the other parts of it. When we have a boundary, all we can do is share what our boundaries are and then give people the freedom to decide for themselves whether they want to respect it or not. Don't try to control them about it or try to hurt or punish them if they don't listen. It's up to us if someone's not going to respect our boundaries. In the perfect world, everyone would respect our boundaries, but we don't live in the perfect world. People might not respect our boundaries, and we have to act accordingly in that case. And in these cases, it's up to us to do something about it. And I think people get caught up on this kind of thing here too, because they think, well, everyone has boundaries. Isn't it right for people to have boundaries? Yes, it is. But there's a way to enforce it. There's a way to communicate it as well. And the other part of this is here, if someone has a boundary that we think is silly or ridiculous, we always have the option to walk away ourselves. And it might just be a compatibility issue at that point. For example, a Trump supporter might think the person who has a boundary that they won't date a Trump supporter, they might think that boundary is ridiculous. But in that case, you just don't have to date. You can walk away. It's a compatibility issue at that point. But let's make one a little stickier here. There are some guys out there, for example, that can be controlling, but they will also twist it into a boundary a little bit. And here's how I would say I would handle that. They might say, I don't want my girlfriend or wife dressing provocatively out in public. And you might think that's a ridiculous boundary. I do think that's a little much, but if you're the person on the receiving end of that, you have a choice too. If that's what someone who you're going to be dating, that's what their boundary is going to be, you don't have to adhere to that. If that's something that you are not comfortable respecting, by all means, you do not have to be in that relationship either. You are free to walk away. And that's just one example of something that I hear sometimes, but it's also a little bit of a hyperbolic example as well. But that is a case of if you don't agree with the boundary, you don't have to be in a relationship with that person. If that's their relationship boundary, that's their relationship boundary. But even in that case too, if they try to force the person to respect it, even when they don't want to, then they have gone too far as well. And I think what people get confused about here is that you're giving people the freedom to decide for themselves. And they'll think, well, shouldn't we be demanding respect? Shouldn't we be teaching other people how to treat us? Yes, but we do that by our actions. And we do that by the consequences we would enforce for boundary breaches. If someone crosses our boundary, we might give them a shot, depending on the severity of the boundary breach. But after that, the only thing left to do is walk away if someone's going to continually not respect our boundaries. And I think the other part of this here is people who were in a toxic relationship, they were so used to having their boundaries be crossed, and maybe some of it was that they didn't even have boundaries to begin with. But even in those cases, and that's part of what healing is all about here, is understanding what you believe in, understanding what your red lines are, and understanding if you're not being treated well, you do not have to put up with that. And I know it becomes difficult when it's a trauma bond, but at the same point, when we have a strong belief in ourselves, we would not let something like that happen to us ever again. But before you become aware, you don't know what you don't know. And those little boundary breaches, it's a death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing, where it starts with a small thing, and then the heat gets cranked up. It's like the frog in the boiling pot. And before you know it, it gets out of control. Yes, I totally understand that. But once you're here, and you're following someone like me, that can't happen to you again. Once you have the awareness, you see every little boundary breach. You understand what's going on. And when someone's not treating you well, you are under no obligations to stay. I would say, depending on how severe the boundary breach is, you can give a consequence once, maybe twice, but anything after that, you're better off walking away, depending on how severe the boundary breach is. Not all boundaries are going to be deal breakers and severely important, right? There's going to be a scale. Some boundaries are extremely important, and if they get crossed once, that's it. An example of an extremely important boundary would be monogamy. If someone cheats, that's a really big deal if you have a monogamous relationship, and that's something that most people probably wouldn't want to tolerate. And I would say once that trust is gone, I don't think you should tolerate it anyway. And that's another one. Once someone's trust is gone, that's a major boundary breach, and you have to do what you have to do after that. But there are other less severe boundary breaches, little things maybe around the house if you're living with one another. Oh, he left the dishes in the sink a couple times. That's a little bit of a minor annoyance, and often that can be a symptom of other issues perhaps, but most people aren't going to leave their partner over dishes in the sink. But if there's that, and then many more things, maybe that's a different story. But that's just an example of there are many versions of boundaries. They are not all level 10 importance, such as monogamy, for example. There are other boundaries that might be just level 1 or level 2. It really just depends. But in every boundary situation, there are two sides. There's the side of the person who has the boundary, and then there's the side of the person receiving the boundary as well. And the person who is listening to the boundary, if the boundary was given respectfully, they'll have a choice. Oh, do I respect this boundary or not? When someone tells me, say for example, someone's a Trump supporter, and they hear no Trumpers allowed on the dating app. What does the Trump supporter do? If they're truly a Trump supporter and they want to be authentic and genuine, they would probably just walk away and swipe left because they know they're not going to get along. But a guy, for example, that maybe just wants to hit it and quit it, maybe he'll swipe right anyway, even though he knows he's never going to get along with this person, but he might still want to sleep with them, so he'll overlook it. But as a woman, that's something to pay attention to. And that's why if it's a relationship boundary for you, and you find out someone is supporting Trump and you don't like him, it's important to stick to your guns. And I don't think I have to tell anyone that. I think most people understand that. And for people who really hate Trump, that's not even going to be something they have to think twice about. They're just going to keep it moving. And the same for the vice versa. Trump supporters, they probably think the same way about people who really like Biden. Not that there's that many people who really like Biden, but that's besides the point. But that's just an example of there are two sides of it. And if you have the proper amount of respect for your partner, you can decide, okay, this is a compatibility issue, or okay, this is a boundary that I want to respect. And even if you don't want to respect the boundary, what you do when you think a boundary is silly or ridiculous is important too. And going back to the controlling boyfriend who wants to control how his girlfriend dresses. And at that point, if you're a girl that doesn't want to be controlled, that's a major red flag at that point for you. And I could say that guy is silly for having that boundary, but if that is what his boundary is, he's allowed to have the boundary he wants. But if you allow yourself to be controlled by that boundary, now that's you. That's on you at that point. Because if you agree to it, you agree to it. But I'm not saying you should agree. I'm saying you also have a choice. There's a choice on what you want to do, and there's a choice in how you communicate your boundaries. Both come into play here. And I guess as I talk about this, it becomes clear to me that I haven't spoken that much about boundaries. I've talked so much about narcissists and toxic behaviors and how they will belittle and abuse other people. But people don't understand as much about, well, how do I communicate a boundary? What's the right way to do it? When you're only talking about the severe cases of narcissism and how they would handle things, the middle of the road cases, the relationships you want to have after a relationship with a narcissist, they don't get talked about. But those are the issues that we really do need to focus on, because if we want to have a loving, caring relationship, that's what's important. Those middle of the road cases. Because when it comes to a narcissist, we know the best thing to do is to walk away, because 99 times out of 100, they're not going to change. But in healthy relationships after a narcissist, it is not that black and white. There are shades of gray in this thing here too. And at that point, it depends. It depends on how we communicate the boundary. When it's not a narcissist, that goes a far way. And if they're not a narcissist, what they do when they hear it, that's important as well. But that's the problem, I think, with talking about narcissism. We can lose sight of the healthy relationships and what they are supposed to be like. And of course, there's an element to talking about narcissism that it's entertainment. It's entertainment and it's interesting, but there does come a point where we do have to move forward a little bit, because I do think it might not serve you after a point. I'll probably still talk about it because there's a time and place for it. People get woken up to this kind of thing all the time. They don't know about narcissism. They don't know about toxic behaviors. And then they find a channel like mine and it wakes them up. And I think it's important for people to be able to find people like me to wake them up. And I'm going to continue talking about that. But I also think it's important to talk about how do we handle the healthy relationships too? Because only a small part of life is dealing with getting away from the narcissist, getting away from an abusive person. And eventually, we want to focus on what are the positives? What are the things that we actually do want in our lives? Because what we focus on will expand. And if we're always thinking about a narcissist, that's probably not a good thing. And I understand ruminating is absolutely a thing. It's hard to stop that cycle. But I did talk about this with Grace Stewart. We talked about a way to interrupt ruminating thoughts, and we mentioned you have an anchoring thought. Anytime you start thinking about the narcissist or abusive person, and you might think, oh, it was my fault. If I only did this, if I only did that, I might have been able to make things different. But you have an anchoring thought that is more based in reality. An anchoring thought that restores you to sanity, for lack of a better word. But those things are important. But we want to focus on what we do want at some point too. A healthy, loving relationship. And if we're over relationships, that's fine too. Then we have to just focus on our goals and maybe our friends and family. There's nothing wrong with that either. I'm all for whatever people want in their lives, whether it's just goals or healthy relationships with friends and family or hobbies or pets, whatever. But I think it's important to also focus on the positive aspects of a relationship too, because learning about narcissism, learning to walk away, learning to break trauma bonds, that's important. It's a very important thing because it's a big deal. When someone's been in those situations for years, it's a big deal. And I think sometimes what happens is people can move through the space and they look back to where they were and they think, oh, it's just silly talking about narcissism. But it's important, and there's wisdom and understanding. People are at where they're supposed to be at. Everyone's going to be at a different place in the healing journey. And we were all there before. And I don't think it's right to judge the people where they are in their journey. Some people are just discovering self-help and the self-help journey. And maybe a narcissist brought them to the space. Or maybe an addiction brought them to the self-help journey. Or maybe some other form of trauma or a mental health issue brought them. And whenever we go into a self-help type mode, whether it's spirituality or recovery or whatever it is, people focus on at first what brought them there. Someone who has a problem with drugs or alcohol, they first think drugs or alcohol are the problem. But then after a little bit, they realize, no, those things were just symptoms of the problem. The real problem is on us and how we handle things, and maybe our mindset and how we deal with our feelings. Those are the real issues. And that's why they say in NA and AA, the drugs or drinking, they were a symptom of the problem. And the symptom is just the tip of the iceberg. But we were probably medicating something, whether it was trauma, CPTSD, or etc. And I'm talking if you were an addict out there. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. The rest of it is on our side. And I think that's what happens in the beginning. People will focus on the drug, they'll focus on the drink, or in the case of this narcissistic abuse space, they'll focus on the narcissist. But eventually we realize we should probably be grateful that we even got put on this path to begin with, because it's a beautiful journey. That's only a part of it. And I don't want to judge anyone who's on that part, because here I am talking about it. Who would I be to judge it? But also at the same point, I do want to keep on talking about positive relationships too, and how to communicate boundaries. And I'm learning by some of the comments on my stuff here that people aren't as familiar with it. And it's probably because I talk so much about the toxic behaviors that when I talk about how to do the positive behaviors, besides the positive behaviors of dealing with a narcissist, which is getting out and no contact, etc., it's a different skill set. It's a different skill set having a healthy relationship than it is dealing with a narcissist. And I think when it comes to a healthy relationship, connection is everything. I made a short video recently about dishonest harmony is what leads to disconnection. Disconnection is why relationships end. And I think the key to keeping connected is having genuine and honest conversations, clear boundaries, clear consequences. That's how it all circles back to me. And I know I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent here, but it's been a while since I've gone on these longer form video tangents. I've been caught up on all these shorts, and I like the shorts. They help people find the channel here, but this long form content, that's where the magic happens. That's where you really learn. That's where the value is, because a short is only 60 seconds. The other part of value, of course, is if someone schedules a coaching session with me. But people find the channel. But this longer form stuff is where I can really dive in. It's where I can really help people the most and really explain these concepts the best I can without a 60-second time frame, because that is really restricting, that 60-second time frame. But in a long form video, I can go for as long as my stream of consciousness allows me to go. But circling back to the boundary part, boundaries, preferences. If it's important enough for us, it's a relationship boundary. If it's not as important for us, it could just be a preference. For example, again, if you're not really political, you might not like Trump, but it's not a deal breaker for you for someone to like Trump. A relationship boundary, if you're monogamous, is you don't want someone to cheat. That's your relationship boundary. And how about with drugs or drinking? Maybe you're not the biggest fan of drugs or drinking, but it's okay for you if someone drinks. It's not your preference that they do, but it's okay. But maybe if you're sober, now it becomes a relationship boundary for you that someone doesn't drink. And I'm not saying that has to be that way, but I have noticed that does happen a lot. If someone's sober, they don't really want to be around people who are drinking too much. And I think a lot of people I know who have gone to AA or NA, after a while, they're more okay with someone that might have a drink occasionally. But if that person is going to have drugs or alcohol be a big part of their lives, that's probably not going to work. That's something that's not going to work. But if someone's sober, if they want to have a relationship boundary that someone doesn't drink, totally fine. And it's up to that other person at that point, do they really respect that or not? Because if someone doesn't respect it, they might try to sneak around the drink occasionally, and that is disrespectful at that point. If you know that's what your partner's boundary is, and you're going to sneak around the drink, that's why I say there's two sides of this here. The person communicating the boundary, and then the person who is listening to the boundary. And one of the principles of boundaries is, if we want our boundaries to be respected, we should respect the boundaries of others. And it'll be the most difficult in the cases that we think the boundary is silly or ridiculous. But even in that case, how we handle it will show our character. And if it's really that silly or ridiculous, for example, someone that isn't really political, but then they find someone that's a Trump supporter, and someone else says, oh, that's a deal breaker for me. How do you handle that? Because you might just realize it's a compatibility issue at that point. Compatibility issues, they're going to happen. They're going to happen. And just because you're not compatible with somebody doesn't mean that person's toxic. I want that to be clear too. And I could already hear people saying, well, in the case of this political thing, there must be toxic if they think this other thing, which is really a symbol of the state of the American nation right now, honestly. But that's just one example of this here. How we handle things when it's a compatibility issue, that shows our character. Not every compatibility issue is going to be, oh my goodness, this person must be toxic. No, in fact, most of them aren't going to mean that. But how do we handle that? But some of them, some of our relationship boundaries, they will be super important to us. And we have to act accordingly when something's super important. So remember these examples, and I use these extreme examples because they help us to really see what's going on. Think monogamy, think smoking, think drugs or alcohol, and think political. Those are the things that would really communicate well preference versus relationship boundary. If it's important enough for us, it can become a relationship boundary. If it's not that important to us and not a deal breaker, then that's more of a preference. And there's other kinds of preferences too, of course. Oh, you like pizza over French fries. That's just a preference, and has nothing really to do with a relationship. The only exception would be maybe some sort of vegan. Maybe a vegan, but this is another good example. Someone's a vegan. Would they date somebody that eats meat? Well, if they date someone who eats meat, it's probably their preference that they would also be a vegan, but it becomes a relationship boundary for them if they refuse to date someone who isn't also a vegan. But that's another good example. And again, it might just be a compatibility issue for someone at that point. Someone eats chicken, meat, eggs, they meet a vegan, probably not compatible at that point. It's no harm, no foul. It just is what it is. Where people go too far is when maybe the vegan tries to force the person who eats meat to not do that anymore and tells them what a terrible person they are. And maybe you could say, oh, there is an ethical argument to be a vegan. Well, I'm not getting into that part. I don't think the world would go round anymore if everyone was a vegan. I eat meat, and I'm sure people would say that means I'm a terrible person, or I'm at least overlooking some ethical concerns, which perhaps I am, but I'm not that good of a person. So I have some chicken, and I have some meat, and I'm sure there's ethical concerns about that, but I'm not on the wavelength to really concern myself with it right now. And I might even get myself in trouble even talking about it at all, but I'm trying to keep it real here with you all too. So that's that. But I know I went all over the place here in this stream of consciousness. If you got this far, please remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video if you liked it. And share this video with somebody else that you think might benefit from hearing it. Boundaries versus preferences. If it's important enough for you, it becomes a deal breaker and a relationship boundary. If it's not that important, it can just be a preference. And of course, boundaries can be how we want to be treated as well. Oh, we don't want to be called names. We can mention that to our partner, but we can't force them. We can't force them to not call us names. All we can do is share the boundary and then give a clear consequence. And if the behavior doesn't change, then we gotta walk away. They've left us no choice. And that goes for the other person too. If you're hearing someone's boundary and how you communicate normally is a problem for somebody else, well, are you going to be able to stop how you communicate normally? Or is it more of a compatibility issue and you're not a good match? Things to think about here. And again, I do want to start talking more about these positive relationship ideas here too, not just the black and white of dealing with a narcissist. I want to talk about love. I want to talk about healthy relationships, healthy assertiveness, stop people pleasing, the things that matter after the trauma bond. I want to start focusing more on that. But again, thank you very much for watching and have a great rest of your day.